Protect your DNA. BioPQQ can promote formation of new mitochondria. Infowarsstore.com.
IRS abuses against political enemies are nothing new. Now, today we're going to have the story of a whistleblowing congressman who decades ago was punished by the IRS. As we're seeing today, we see echoes in Dinesh D'Souza's persecution by the government. We see echoes of it, of course, in the Tea Party persecution that you just saw. This is a congressman that the IRS tried to get out of office by dirty tricks. When that failed, they came after him not only 3 times with criminal prosecutions, which he ultimately beat, but again, they came after him a 4th time, and they tortured him as part of that prosecution. Today, we're going to be talking to investigative journalist Mark Adams about the case of Congressman George Hansen, who recently died.
This is an agency that was so abusive. It chilled political speech during the 2012 election. It chilled Tea Party groups from fully engaging the issues.
Because the FBI has not talked to you about the lost emails of Lois Lerner.
They have not.
Has anyone at the Justice Department talked with you or anyone at the Internal Revenue Service about Lois Lerner's lost emails?
I don't know.
Here's the takeaway. Lois Lerner is trying to cover her tracks. And this guy tells us he hasn't even talked to the FBI. What kind of investigation is going on where the FBI won't even talk to the head of the agency that has this kind of stuff going on with their email exchange and won't talk to the agency that lost key evidence in an investigation that's about people's First Amendment rights being targeted? And we get these flippant answers from the commissioner. That's what just bothers. That's what bothers every single American.
The Department of Justice's investigation of this has been woefully negligent.
The biggest part of this is what involvement did the Department of Justice have as well.
Well, thank you for joining us, Mr. Adams.
Thank you for having me, Mr. Knight.
Now, what we're seeing here, it looks like, is we've got the Obama administration obviously using the IRS to target political enemies, to target people they don't like. We see actually some leadership in the GOP that doesn't like the Tea Party either. I think that's a factor in that. We've seen this kind of persecution from the same people from the IRS, along with, and this is an important point we want to cover today, along with the Attorney General, the Department of Justice. We've seen this happen decades ago with Congressman George Hansen. That's why we've got you on to talk about that today.
Well, indeed, you're right. On a previous Alex Jones broadcast, we exposed how the IRS has gotten away with far worse than intimidating free speech. The IRS has an established history of rigging federal elections.
Yes.
This lawless agency has sabotaged selected candidates by planting lies in the media. They did this to Senator Ed Long in 1968 by planting lies in Life magazine. This outrage, by the way, that happened after the senator publicly warned how the IRS too often behaves like a Gestapo that preys on defenseless citizens.
And Congressman Hansen's case is a very good example of this. Let's kind of take this in a timeline, because I think a lot of people have heard bits and pieces about this, how we had a congressman 30 years ago, 35, 40 years ago, who basically took on the IRS, got them angry, they came after him, got him out of Congress, put him in jail, actually even eventually got him tortured. Let's start at the very beginning, how he got the IRS angry with him.
Well, if I had to point to any single event, I would say things really came to a head in 1976 when the Teton Dam burst.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, the IRS came up with these different schemes so that they could levy taxes on the relief monies that was being supplied to the ranchers and farmers.
Right. So Congressman Hansen took on the IRS on behalf of his constituents, got that removed, the flood tax. But actually, even before that, he had written a book about IRS abuses called To Harass Our People, right?
Yes, all this sort of happened around the same time period. You're right. He was fighting them on many different fronts.
Yeah, he wrote and got passed the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, which still figures prominently today. He also was the first man to propose a flat tax because he was concerned that the complex tax code that the IRS has been given gives them a free hand to do anything to people that they want to. Essentially, if the law is sufficiently complex, some people have said, it's the same as having no law at all. And that's what we have in our IRS code. It is so complex, it's as if there is no law, so they can essentially do whatever they want to people, to political enemies. That's what's going on with the Tea Party. We see them being used to harass and intimidate political organizations. But the case of Congressman Hansen, it was very specific, very unique, and really pretty heinous, wasn't it?
Well, it was. As we said, the first real target was back in '68 with Senator Ed Long.
Mm-hmm.
Then it was Senator Joseph Montoya in 1975. They planted lies in the press about him. This time it was not in Life magazine. That was with the participation of Bob Woodward and the Washington Post.
Mm-hmm.
Then in the next year, 1976, IRS operatives, they used the same blueprint of destruction on Congressman George Hansen from Idaho.
Dirty tricks, essentially, just before the election, publishing that he has tax problems, right?
That he wasn't paying his taxes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But it backfired on them.
Right.
Congressman Hansen won re-election despite the IRS planted lies in the media that he wasn't paying his taxes.
And let's back up a little bit here, too, because not only did he get them upset, exposing abuses, writing a book, enacting a law, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, proposing a flat tax to basically simplify things so they didn't have that free hand. But actually, there was an episode where Lee Roderick, who is a past president of the National Press Club, while he was vacationing in Europe with his wife, said he started talking to an IRS agent that was working over there. And of course, the subject of Congressman Hansen came up. And he said, the IRS agent said, we're going to get him. He said, how? And he said, we have our ways.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Now, this happened, like I said, that happened after the IRS tried to sabotage his 1976 election.
Mm-hmm.
After that, the IRS retaliated again by putting Congressman Hansen through the ringer with a criminal audit.
Yes, yes.
Well, the upshot of that was it was determined he was owed a refund.
Yes, exactly.
Now,
yeah, and a criminal audit,
did
that's
the IRS back off? No, not one bit. It merely intensified their animosity, and as you just pointed out, they were bragging publicly how they were going to get him because we have our ways.
Yes. And as you point out, it was a criminal prosecution. You know, a criminal audit, people are afraid of IRS audits normally, but when they come after you for a criminal audit, that's another item entirely. So he wins and actually gets a refund when they investigate it, but it costs him a lot of money. And he's not somebody like Harry Reid or Nancy Pelosi that becomes multi-millionaires while they're in Congress. This is a guy who didn't have a lot of money, so he gets into a financial situation where he needs to pay some legal expenses, and that's where his troubles start to truly begin. Tell us about that, what he did to try to get money to pay off his legal expenses.
Yes. What happened here is that he approached the Ethics Committee and asked if he could use his congressional office to raise funds to pay off these massive legal debts. They told him, no, you can't do that. So what he did next, with the advice of two attorneys, was to execute a property separation agreement with his wife, Connie, so she could engage in fundraising. All of this massive debt was now legally hers. So while George was busy being a congressman, she was at home trying to raise the capital to pay off what were now her debts. This all took place, by the way, in 1977.
Mm-hmm.
Then, in 1979, 2 years later, the Ethics in Government Act is passed. One of the provisions of the Ethics Act required representatives and senators now had to file disclosure forms with the Ethics Committee. And these disclosure forms had to include not only all of their financial transactions, but their spouse's finances as well. In other words, joint disclosure was now required.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that provision, that violated the property separation agreement that Congressman Hansen was abiding by 2 years before the Ethics Act was even passed.
Mm-hmm.
So he approached the Ethics Committee, and what happened was there's a mutual agreement reached with the Ethics Committee that Congressman Hansen would not include his wife's finances due to his unique legal circumstance that existed prior to the passage of the Ethics in Government Act.
Okay, so he's gone through the extra mile. He goes to the Ethics Committee. He sets up things in a legal structure so that his wife is free to pay off these legal debts. And then he gets this okayed by the House Ethics Committee on 2 occasions, even after they changed the rules. And still, they come after him for that. But before they do, I think it's interesting that Mr. Hunt, the silver trader, who recently died, it was just a couple of days ago, he tried to corner the silver market in 1979, 1980, and he got caught doing that. He was suspended for life with commodities trading, and he was also, I'm sure, got into some legal issues with the IRS. He says that he receives a blackmail letter from somebody saying that they're going to expose that he got favors from Congressman Hansen.
Yeah.
And so they started an investigation on him. That lasts for 2 years, but he's cleared. I think it's kind of interesting. I wonder if Hunt was being used by some kind of a plea bargaining thing where if he would go after Congressman Hansen, they would essentially let him off of maybe some of his IRS problems. I'm sure he had some IRS problems after the major debacle in trying to corner the silver market failed. But I think that's another issue there where they're coming in, they come after time after time after time after Congressman Hansen. He's vindicated, but his legal fees continue to pile on top of each other. They're bankrupting him through the defense of his innocence.
Yes. Your speculation is interesting. I don't think they cut any deal with Nelson Bunker Hunt. However, there was an employee of his, Arthur Emmons, and it appears that he, in fact, was an agent provocateur for the government.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that this would just kind of come out of the blue. They would fight over it for 2 years. Then again, he would be exonerated, just like he was with the dirty tricks before the election, with the criminal audit from the IRS. But then it gets to somebody who's very much in the news today, and that's James Cole, the current Deputy Attorney General at the Department of Justice, the person who's right under former Attorney General Eric Holder, who just left. And James Cole now comes into this picture 20, 35 years ago, I guess. Maybe it's about 35 years ago. He comes into this picture now with a prosecution coming after this separation agreement. Tell us about that.
Okay, here's what happened. Because of the blackmail attempt, that was a pretext then to investigate the congressman. And as you pointed out, James Cole, well, there's James Cole and another attorney, Reed Weingarten. They were working in the so-called public integrity section of the Justice Department. So now they're called in to investigate this blackmail attempt. Well, after investigating Congressman Hansen for almost 2 years, they admit there was no quid pro quo between Congressman Hansen and Nelson Bunker Hunt. Hansen did not perform any tasks or execute any favors on behalf of Nelson Hunt.
Mm-hmm.
But then these headhunters, what they did was to contrive to frame a criminal case against Congressman Hansen. And the issue they used was he omitted his wife's finances on his financial disclosure documents.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now,
this is the third criminal, this is the third time they've tried to come after him with criminal proceedings. The first 2 times he's been exonerated. This third time they come after him with criminal proceedings. Go ahead.
Yes. Now, to do that, they had to do several things. First, they had to ignore the fact that the Ethics Committee accommodated the congressman's filings due to his unique legal circumstance. They also had to ignore the fact that when the Ethics in Government Act was passed, if there were genuine violations here, there were supposed to be civil sanctions imposed,
Yes.
not criminal sanctions.
Yes.
So here's what they did. Weingarten and Cole, they contrived a criminal case against Congressman Hansen by invoking a catch-all provision in criminal law. It's 18 U.S.C. 1001. Essentially, it says it's illegal to submit a false document to the government.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in order to appreciate here the scope and depth of the treachery that was used to ensnare Congressman Hansen, we also have to consider other high-profile cases that were taking place during that time. Now, in 1984, this is when Ed Meese was appointed to the position of Attorney General by President Ronald Reagan. During his confirmation hearings, it was revealed that Ed Meese had not included his wife's finances on his financial disclosure filings.
Yes.
He said that he had inadvertently failed to list them, and he was in the process of amending his financial disclosure.
Because he got caught. Exactly. But they give him a pass for the same thing that they are going after Congressman Hansen for. And it's a civil violation in the case of Congressman Hansen, but they go after him criminally, even though they give Ed Meese, who has been Ronald Reagan's at this time, he has been Ronald Reagan's counselor since the beginning of the Reagan administration in 1980. He had worked with him as governor, as Reagan was governor in California. Now he's going to become Attorney General, and they give him a pass on that. They even actually gave him a pass on some things that did look like there were some quid pro quos in his past. He had a guy, Thomas Barrick, gave him $70,000 in order to help him sell his house. Subsequently was appointed Deputy Undersecretary of the Interior. Another guy, John McKean, gave Meese $60,000 in personal loans. Subsequently was named to the U.S. Postal Service Board of Governors. So you got Reagan's close Confederate, essentially his legal counselor, the guy that's going to become his Attorney General. He's given a pass on these things that they came after that they falsely accused Congressman Hansen of, and giving him a pass on the non-disclosure of the money that his wife earned. Is that correct?
You are exactly correct. It gets even worse. Remember, 1984 was the election year.
Mm-hmm.
Walter Mondale was running as the Democrat for the president. He chose Representative Geraldine Ferraro as his running mate. It was determined, she was vetted out then, that indeed she had not included her husband's financial transactions on her disclosure documents. Her reason was she claimed that she didn't understand the law. Well, in fact, her husband had many shady business dealings, including an enterprise known as Star Distributors. They were a major distributor of pornography linked to organized crime. So
she didn't want to have that disclosed, so she basically excluded his information, and she kept it that way, didn't she? I don't think she never did disclose voluntarily his financial information. Is that correct?
She never did, and she escaped with impunity.
You know, when I was looking this up, I had forgotten about this. The New York Times article from 2008, as they were looking at Sarah Palin, who had just been picked, they said, you know, maybe McCain didn't vet her too well. Remember what happened when Mondale picked Geraldine Ferrara and all these things blew up? You know, maybe the same thing's going to happen with Palin. So they went back and they rehashed this in the New York Times, and they said that her husband had been fined $750 by the FEC for loaning $110,000 to her campaign, her congressional campaign in '78. Now, that was 110 times what the legal limit was. He could have loaned her $1,000, but he loaned her $110,000 and was only fined $750. Now, her children gave her $24,000 over the $3,000 legal limit as well. Nothing happened to them. Compare that to what happened to Dinesh D'Souza today, where we see that not only did he not just get a slap on the wrist with a $750 fine, he was criminally prosecuted and is going to jail. That's similar to what we're seeing happening with Mr. Hansen, Congressman Hansen.
Well, yes, indeed, you're right again. And it's even worse. Congressman Hansen's staff attorney, James McKenna, he researched the matter further, and he discovered, I don't remember the exact number, but it was somewhere between a fourth and a third of the members of the House of Representatives did not include their spouse's finances on their disclosure documents.
There you go.
Across the board,
Yeah.
they were allowed to amend their disclosure statements without consequence.
So very, very selective prosecution of Congressman Hansen for things that very high-profile candidates have done and that a third of the congressional candidates have done as well. But they come after him, and not even for the civil penalty, but for the criminal penalty. So then tell us what happens.
Yes. Senator Hatch summarized it quite well in an article that he wrote titled George Hansen and Congressional Intent. And here's his final paragraph. He says, George Hansen has lost his recent re-election attempt by less than 100 votes, a loss undoubtedly attributable to his criminal trial. This is a tragic mistake. We certainly should not compound this error by unconstitutionally sending him to prison.
Mm-hmm.
But yet, Congressman Hansen, the one who worked directly with the Ethics Committee to reconcile his filings commensurate with his unique legal situation, he ends up being prosecuted by James Cole at the Justice Department.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And James Cole, who is now the Deputy Attorney General, the second highest, actually, I guess right now, until he resigns, he's announced that he's going to resign as well. So at the moment, I guess he is the highest ranking person in the Department of Justice. Now, he is ultimately convicted in a rigged trial because the district judge would not allow correspondence between Congressman Hansen and the Ethics Committee that would have exonerated him. They keep that evidence that would have exonerated him out of the trial. So it's a rigged trial. And he's found guilty. He is sent to jail for a year and a half. I think he's fined $40,000. But the story doesn't end there, does it?
No, indeed it does not. And you are right. In 1986, after many years of fighting government injustices, he is sent to prison. His crime? He didn't commit any crime. The government had to manufacture one in order to ensnare him. And one journalist who was really on top of all this, he was working at the time for Human Events, and that's Stanton Evans. And he explained the odious situation succinctly. This is what he wrote. In 1977, he, George Hansen, and his wife executed a property division in the state of Idaho so that she could raise money apart from his campaign finances to pay legal bills. This division was reported to and ratified by the Ethics Committee of the House of Representatives. Then Evans goes on to write, apologists for Ferraro argue that her cases and Hansen's are different. as indeed they are. Hansen, he had legal grounds for not reporting his wife's financial
That's
dealings.
right. Yeah.
He had the advice of two attorneys saying he should not report them, and the response from the Ethics Committee that was attested by Representative Wiggins saying that, yes, this was proper conduct.
So let's bring this back. Let's bring this kind of into the future here. So we've got a situation where the Department of Justice persecutes this guy. And of course, Ed Meese, who at that time is the head of the Department of Justice and who himself was guilty of far more egregious offenses than Congressman Hansen, he lets that stand. And Congressman Hansen continues to try to clear his name, and eventually the Supreme Court does exonerate him of all these charges, but that takes till 1995. It's 11 years later, after he's been fined $40,000, after he's out of Congress, after he's served a year and a half in prison. And so what we see here is we see the Republican administration of Ronald Reagan and Ed Meese essentially doing the same kinds of dirty tricks against somebody who speaks up trying to reform the IRS. And now we bring this into the future. We see that the leadership of the GOP is really not doing much to put pressure on stopping these persecutions of Tea Party people because, in my opinion, I think they're just as much of a pariah to the current GOP leadership as someone who wanted to shake up the IRS was to the Republican leadership 30, 40 years ago.
Well, indeed, yes, that's true. And while all this was happening, meanwhile, the media whores were busy publishing articles claiming that George Hansen was sent to prison for lying on his ethics forms.
Yeah, which they didn't even allow in evidence.
Media lie that was sold to the public.
Yes, yes. And they could get away with it in those days as well. One of the things that he tried to do was to come up with a Congressional Accountability Project that would inform people instantly of how their congressman voted, because in those days they didn't have the internet. Today we can do that. And even though we understand where this corruption, this criminal behavior is coming from, we apparently are still impotent to do anything about it, because not only do we see the same practices being done decades later, but even the same people being rewarded and promoted. So you've got James Cole, who is head of the division, doing these persecutions. It's not even prosecutions. They were persecutions of Congressman Hansen. He's now been rewarded in a Democrat administration, being put as the second person in charge of the Justice Department.
Indeed, you're right. And as you say, today we have the fulminating IRS Tea Party scandal that supposedly is being investigated by the FBI and the Justice Department. Last August, Jay Sekulow, he's the chief attorney at the Center for Law and Justice, he declared, and the truth is that evidence clearly shows the DOJ was involved in the coordinated targeting and was directly engaged with IRS officials, including Lois Lerner, to piece together criminal prosecutions against Tea Party clients without any evidence of wrongdoing. Now, last February, Jay Sekulow bitterly complained to Congress that the FBI had not interviewed any of his Tea Party clients. At that time, not a single Tea Party victim was interviewed by the FBI. Last June, when Sekulow learned about the coordinated effort involving the Public Integrity Section and the IRS working together to try to contrive criminal prosecutions against the Tea Party, he advised all of his clients, do not submit to any interviews from the FBI. Now, last July, when he was testifying, James Cole, he made remarks to Congress saying that
the career people we have at the Department of Justice are really some of the best and most honest lawyers I've ever seen. The amount of integrity that's there is really quite astounding.
And yet, here we have this other group who also has been investigating the Justice Department. They say hundreds of Justice Department attorneys violated professional rules, laws, or ethical standards. Last July, James Cole testified to Congress.
If somebody brought to our attention evidence of a crime, we would of course look into it. But if somebody wanted us to target somebody because of their political beliefs, we would not go down that road.
Well, here's how Congressman George Hansen describes the Justice Department. The kingmakers at the Justice Department play selective politics, but the degree depends upon whether they want to control you, teach you a lesson, terminate your career, or destroy you. That's from the grave of George Hansen. James Cole, you putrid, bloated pile of rotten maggot scum. Thanks for the interview. After looking at that picture of James Cole, I feel an urgent need to get my stomach pumped.
Oh, Mark, we're almost out of time, but I want to bring this up today because most of the people that have heard about Congressman Hansen, the main thing that they're thinking about is the torture that he underwent. And we haven't talked about that yet because that's part of the next thing that they did to him. You know, he fights for 11 years to clear his name, and it looks like, obviously, he's going to be exonerated. He ultimately was by the Supreme Court. But before that happened, just as it was about to happen, they bring another action against him of bank fraud charges. And that judge was far more egregious in his behavior, I believe, than the previous judge who just basically convicted him by keeping information out of the trial that would have exonerated him. This judge comes after him. I would say this is the penalty phase because now, this time, he gets a much longer jail sentence and he is tortured in the process leading up to the trial as well as afterwards. Tell us about that.
Well, that actually took place after the trial when he was convicted before a crooked judge. And this took place in Idaho. Now, when they railroaded Congressman Hansen to prison the first time, he was in prison in the federal facility in Petersburg, Virginia. So after the second kangaroo conviction, which took place in Idaho, then they decided, well, all right, let's get him back out to Petersburg in Virginia. So they did. They took a month doing it.
And during that month, nobody knew where he was. His attorneys didn't know where he was. His wife didn't know where he was. They disappeared him out of the system. And what they did was they used a form of torture that they usually reserve for violent, uncontrollable criminals, basically shackling them in a very tight manner that cuts off circulation to their hands and to their feet.
They did that, and to ensure that that happened, what you just described, they also attached a black box to the chains to keep them tightened. And then they would leave him like that for 12, 14, 18 hours a day.
Wow, that's just amazing. So, you know, when we come forward today and we look at what just was brought to light earlier this week, we see that The Guardian reported that a U.S. judge has ordered the American government to identify what was happening, give an explanation for 2,100 pictures that they have of prisoners who are being tortured in Afghanistan and Iraq. And we have the Obama administration defending what the Bush administration did. Rather, they're not even using it for political advantage, but they're basically saying, you can't see this. Should we be surprised when 35 years ago, our American government persecuted both Republicans and Democrats, persecuted someone who stood up to the system, pointed out the injustices of the IRS, and he got prison and tortured in the process and had his life destroyed?
That is indeed correct. And all of this, so much of it, comes back to James Cole. What was revealed earlier this year by Judicial Watch were emails that showed how back in 2010, 4 years ago, how the Public Integrity Section was colluding with the IRS to try to figure out a way to rig prosecution on Tea Party organizations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting to me to see these public integrity organizations. You know, here in Texas, we have a very high-profile case. It's gone national now because it's resulted in the indictment of Governor Perry because we had the head of the Public Integrity Unit get very, very drunk and in the process get physically and verbally abusive as part of her arrest. That went viral. And after that, the governor said, unless she resigns, I'm not going to give any more money to this so-called Public Integrity Unit. And because of that, now they've indicted him. So, I mean, that's the kind of upside down society we live in. I mean, I'm sure there's things that there are things in terms of Gardasil and other things like that that Governor Perry has done that I think people ought to come after him for indictment for, but not for that. So for the very thing that he did that was right, they come after him because this is where the political power is in these so-called public integrity units. That's where they go after the political opponents, isn't it? Saying that they're upholding integrity. It's kind of like the Patriot Act, where they destroy the Constitution saying they're going to protect us from terrorists.
Indeed. Now, Judicial Watch, well, they dragged James Crow to testify before Congress about this collaboration between the Public Integrity Section and the IRS. And
this is as part of today's IRS prosecutions against the harassment against the Tea Party. Go ahead.
Yes, indeed. When Cole was testifying, he claimed that Justice Department attorneys from the Public Integrity Section, they were reaching out to the IRS in an attempt to educate themselves on the ramifications of changes in campaign finance laws. Well, last May, the Oversight Committee interviewed two lawyers from the Public Integrity Section, Richard Pilger and Jack Smith. During his interview, Richard Pilger refused to answer 34 questions submitted to him. Jack Smith, who's the current chief of the Public Integrity Section, he also refused to answer critical questions. So if there is nothing inappropriate in this coordinated effort between the so-called Public Integrity Section and the IRS, why is it shrouded in so much secrecy?
Yes, exactly.
Now, what happened last summer, Judicial Watch, they issued this statement. The DOJ has been corrupt. Justice Department officials might themselves be implicated in coordinating a campaign to potentially jail Tea Party organizers.
Yes, exactly. And that's where it's ultimately going to go. It's all about persecuting your enemies. As I said before, if you've got a law that is sufficiently complex, it's the same as having no law at all. And so it's been decades that we've had governments using the IRS to punish their political opponents. Congressman Hansen's example is one of the best examples we could have. That's why this is such an important story for people to see, and we can see the repercussions of it in the current day as we see Dinesh D'Souza being attacked criminally for things that other people are doing and at the most getting a civil fine for. We see them doing the same thing to the Tea Party organizations, building up to not just harass them, but to criminally prosecute them. That's why we need to have reform. Thank you so much for talking to us today, Mark. And we'll be looking forward to your further investigative journalism about the IRS and about Congressman Hansen.
Thank you for the time that you put me on the air.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Good day.
Well, and I should put in as a footnote that even though he was convicted the fourth time and he, I believe, did not have the will or the energy to exonerate himself, many people who have looked at that case, who have reviewed it, say they believe that was a false conviction as well. Well, that's it for tonight's Nightly News. Join us weeknights, 7 Central, 8 p.m. Eastern.
City of Austin tap water versus filtered City of Austin tap water.
I can taste dirt in it.
God knows what's in this.
This has an aftertaste.
Tastes like Austin water? Yeah, it does. Ugh.
These people just sampled City of Austin tap water straight from the faucet. Next, we had them try a sample of tap water filtered through the ProPure G2.0 filtration system.
High quality H2O.
That one is better.
Tastes like nothing.
Yep, I know what good water tastes like. It's good water.
Most tap water contains added substances like fluoride, chlorine, Monsanto's deadly pesticide, glyphosate, and many others. Studies prove that these substances are linked to an assortment of major health issues, including tooth decay, lowered IQ, and even cancer.
It tastes like you're drinking out of the lake when you're drinking tap water.
Yeah, it has that processed flavor to it.
The ProPure G2.0 filtration system removes these deadly substances and many more, leaving only fresh-tasting, deliciously clean water.
Okay, this is very tasty.
It's good water.
Refreshing.
It's good.
Go to InfoWarsStore.com today. Use promo code WATER and save 10% off your ProPure purchase. Again, that's InfoWarsStore.com or call 1-888-253-3139.
You are watching the Infowars Nightly News, which airs 7 p.m. Central at InfoWarsNews.com. Members can share their passcodes with up to 11 other people, and your support is helping us defend liberty worldwide.